In light of the unprecedented attacks by Iranian forces on Israel over the weekend, and on the 64th day since the Senate passed a bipartisan national security supplemental bill, I come to the floor to once again call on the House to pass critical funding for Ukraine, for Israel, for the Indo-Pacific, and importantly, for our own national security needs here at home. Over the past 6 months, I've worked with senators from both sides of the aisle to urge passage of supplemental funding to support our national security. And I am beyond disappointed that Speaker Johnson and House Republicans have delayed much-needed critical aid, especially given the Senate bill that passed here with 70 bipartisan votes. I believe, and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle believe, that that would pass the House if only the Speaker would bring the bill to the floor. Now, we hear this week that House Republicans may be nearing a vote on this aid, and while I'm encouraged by that, it is way past time for us to help the courageous Ukrainians who are fighting literally for the life of their country. As chair of the European Subcommittee of the Foreign Relations Committee, like so many in this chamber, I've met with President Zelensky, traveled to Ukraine, met with the women and men who are on the front lines of this war. I know the dire state of affairs right now against Russia. We've heard from our nation's top 4-star generals, every single combatant commander. They have stressed the importance of what happens in Ukraine to operations elsewhere around the world. Fortunately, Ukrainians remain fearless in the face of the brutality and aggression from Russia. But what the United States and our allies must do at this critical juncture is provide the military and economic support to help Ukraine win and define victory on its own terms. We must act now to ensure Ukraine's continued survival. We've heard testimony that right now, for every shell that's being fired by the Ukrainians, 5 are being fired by Russia. And if we wait another month or more, it will be 10 for every shell that Ukrainians are firing. And ensuring Ukraine's survival is not just about Ukraine. It's about pushing back on Vladimir Putin's campaign to return to the days of Soviet occupation and aggression. We've seen this movie before with Vladimir Putin. In 2008, he invaded Georgia. In 2014, he illegally annexed Crimea and parts of the Donbass in Ukraine. And then, of course, 2 years ago, he launched his full-scale, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. If he wins, if the West fails to support Ukraine, we know that Vladimir Putin is not going to stop. We've heard from the leaders of the Baltic nations, of Poland, of other states in Eastern Europe, their fears for what happens if Vladimir Putin is successful in Ukraine. And instead of letting Putin rewrite the rules of the road, we should put an end to his thinking that he can do as he pleases without consequences. Delays by the House of Representatives to pass this supplemental has enabled Putin's delusional agenda. And we've already heard from the chairman, the Republican chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Mike Turner, Chairman Mike McCall from the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who have already said that 1/3 of the Republican caucus are listening and spouting Russian disinformation. And this isn't just about Ukraine. American aid and support deters other bad actors from initiating conflict in other parts of the world. And 6 months of inaction by Congress has enabled our adversaries. We saw it as recently as this weekend when Iranian forces fired off hundreds of drones and rockets toward Israel. Now, as There is the potential for a broader war in the Middle East that could imperil more innocent lives and make the world more dangerous. It's more important than ever that we take action in Congress, because these episodes, Ukraine, the attack in Israel, what's happening in the Indo-Pacific, they don't happen in silos. Our adversaries are connected. They're sharing weapons and reveling in our inability to act. Iran is currently supplying more than 70% of Russia's drone capabilities. A top Chinese official was just in North Korea for the highest level talks in years. And the Secretary General of NATO branded this partnership as a dangerous authoritarian alliance. And he's right. This group of dictators, autocrats, and adversaries threatens democracies. It's a threat that's very much like what we saw in the lead up to World War II. And if we don't pass the supplemental, our adversaries like Iran will expand their own campaigns of aggression. If you're concerned about what China's doing, if you're concerned about what Iran is doing, the best way to deal a blow to these authoritarians is to support the Ukrainians in their effort to defeat Putin. We have a chance to take a stand for freedom and democracy. If only our House colleagues would finally pass the National Security Supplemental. I just got back from the Indo-Pacific with a congressional delegation that included 6 members of the Senate and 1 member of the House. It was bipartisan and bicameral. And what we heard in the nations that we visited in the Indo-Pacific was that they understand the connection between what's going on in Ukraine and what's happening with China, with great power competition, with the aggression in the Indo-Pacific and the South China Sea, and against Taiwan. If the House will pass the National Security Supplemental, we could degrade Russia, we could degrade the Iranian military capabilities, and we could do it without costing American lives. We can boost our economy through our defense industrial base. And support for Ukraine and our allies isn't a blank check, it's not charity. The United States is providing Ukraine with critical equipment to defend itself and its territory. This equipment is pulled from U.S. stocks, which also means that it's putting people to work back at home. But despite misinformation from too many House Republicans, a majority of the funding in the bill the Senate sent over more than 60 days ago is spent in the United States. It would be spent to replenish our own military stocks so that we can continue to meet our military requirements. It would shore up our military readiness and ensure the U.S. industrial base can keep up with demand. A destabilized Europe as a result of Ukraine losing this war would be a disaster for the U.S. economy. In my home state of New Hampshire alone, we export about $3 billion each year to Europe, which is our largest trading partner. Putin poses a serious threat to our security and a peaceful, prosperous future. Our allies know this, and that's why by the end of this year, 18 NATO countries will meet the 2% defense spending goal set by the alliance. This historic investment in our collective security shows that the United States is not shouldering this burden alone. We can depend on our allies, and they must be able to depend on us. Let's remind ourselves that our NATO allies stood by our side after September 11th. Right now, leaders from around the world are looking for the United States to step up and pass this bill. What message does it send to our allies if we ignore their pleas for support to save lives and ensure our collective security? What message does it send to our grandchildren if we tell them that we're willing to gamble sending them to fight in another war in Europe? Because if there's one thing we know, it's that Putin is not going to stop in Ukraine. America doesn't back down when it's called upon to defend freedom. At least we never have. Ukraine is now on the front lines of the fight for democracy and freedom. We have the resources to act here. We have the ability to act. Now it's time for everyone in the House to find the courage to act, because failure is not an option. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.